Well, this book is my, or was my debut novel, and the English title of it is Amongst Loners. It is basically a family novel, but it's told from several perspectives. And since I was young and I thought I could write anything, I was not only telling those several perspectives of the family, but also there's another level to the story where I'll introduce it in a way that it starts off the book with the mother coming home from some shopping errands she has run, and she falls very unfortunately and dies pretty soon after that. And so the other characters in the novel basically are shown how they react and how they deal with this death. And one of the characters, who is a young student, a son, he reacts in a way that he sits down and writes something like an alternative family story. Although it's not like a happy utopia story, but it also has its dark sides. But in that story that he's writing, the family deals with it in a different way. They are more warm, they're more close, other than in the so-called real story where they more separating and fighting with each other. Well, in the beginning I didn't specifically want it. It's just it happened that I, weirdly enough, I just was writing. I was writing this book and I was writing that book, and at some point I felt like, well, they were influencing each other quite a bit, because if you work at several projects at the same time, that can happen. And so at one point I realized like it would be very interesting to have that actually in one book, to have those two stories reflecting on each other, where like in the one story there's a character who doesn't play a big role. He's just known for being fat or whatever, and he has that name. Appears in the other story again, but this time he's a different kind of person, maybe much more important, still a fat kind of type, but he's a completely different constellation to the other characters. And I think what I found interesting about that was a little bit the relation which we always have, like between imagination and so-called reality, between truth, untruth, between like the real world, the virtual world, or the real world and the fictional world, and how they influence each other. And I mean, if you want to talk about the focus or the core of all it, it often reminds me of that the topic when you get asked as a writer, you get like one of the main questions you always get, and which most writers I think hate, is so where do you get your ideas from? And the simple and usually most honest answer to that is that you don't know it. I feel more. It's more like sometimes of course I've got that name or that information from somewhere, but most of the time you feel more like a medium. It all goes through you. I don't create something new. It has been somewhere, and I don't know how, but it went through me and it went into the text. So, and that's also a little bit, I think if you read a book, there's always something else that people make connections with between the two stories. And many people who have read it told me, yeah, it's interesting. In that part, in this scene, there's so much yellow, and in the other story, there's this one person with yellow eyes. So how does this cohere? Like, what was the connection there? And I was like, oh yeah, I didn't realize that there was a connection actually. But so I think it's just this relation between two worlds. And I mean, of course, they're both fictional in the book, but even though one is supposedly a little bit less. Not I mean, quite simply in the sense that they alternate, and the one level is basically it always says from which family member's perspective it is being told. So you just find the name and then the story starts, although within the story the name is never mentioned again, because maybe this also was a little bit overthinking at that time. But I found interesting that many books where you have this third person character, you have like a character like Thomas, and then it always the third person is so often told from his perspective, although it always says Thomas. And sometimes it works, but there are also sometimes books where if they don't do it well enough, then it always reminds me that nobody thinks of himself with his first name. I don't think like Christopher is going there. Although sometimes in the novel that's what you want to suggest. So I tried to stay away from the name, and so within those family members chapters, it always just says he or she, although it starts with the name. And the other chapters are just they're a little bit more like book chapters, so they like have the title, a proper title, and they're and we always know that that the person it's also told from the first perspective. It's like the character's name is Jasper, and he always says I. So you definitely know it's a different tone, it's a different voice that is speaking to you, and so I think people can distinct the two. In the the author has a different name, but in the story he calls himself Jasper, which again is like can be confusing. But then if you read up for a while, I think you notice why he does that. There are several reasons. First of all, of course, if you just lost your mother and he had a really good close relationship to his mother, he invents this other character called Jasper, who is also losing someone very dear to him, and so he can put some of his feelings and his problems inside this character, but at the same time distance him from himself, from that character, since it's not his name. Yeah, like the surrounding stories, so-called, like what is supposedly the real story in the book. Although I made both of them up, is always starts out with the name of the character through whose eyes it is being told. So there's the mother, the son, the daughter, and the father. Whereas the story within the story is like more like a book. So it says like it has a title, and then sometimes there's the year in which that happened, and so it's more like this more traditional way of the writer sitting down and inventing a title for the story. And it's also the whole vibe about it, the whole tone and the voice more sounds like someone who's storytelling something. It's like, like back when I remember that summer and that time and what happened back then, and there's so many things happened back then in that summer. It's more this voice of remembering and trying to get hold of that memory. Whereas the other story is like told in the present, and it's like just more or less what the character is doing right now, and caught in that moment, and so that's the contrast between the two. Yeah, the story is different. The core of both stories is like a family who has more or less issues, has to deal with a certain death in the family, very tragic deaths in both cases, but they deal in a very different way with it. And since the character in the one story is suffering from that, he's making up that other story, and so the other story that he's making up is a lot about the reflection. It tells a lot about him in the end, because if you read what he's written, you get an idea of like what he wishes would have happened in his family, what he expects a good family to behave like, and also how he feels. Because if we would only read the authors, like the surrounding stories, so to say, then it would work by itself. Although, for example, with this character who's writing the story, we would get the feeling, I'm pretty sure, that he's quite distanced and cold character, and that and very introverted, and that we don't know a lot about him. But once we read the story he's writing, the story is has so much more warmth and is so much more heartfelt, that I think when we read the story, we suddenly get an idea about who he is. But of course, this shouldn't suggest that that if you read the book by a writer, that you get a good feeling about what's happening inside him. But to a certain extent, of course, that's true. But also only to a certain extent. Yeah, a little bit like that. Although, of course, it would have been a very boring book to just write the fantasy and utopia of a person who just writes, I wish my family would be like that, and then everybody would be happy and nice with everybody. Because, I mean, you can't really tell a good story if there's only good things happening. It will be very, very tough. I mean, there might be some writers around, but if you just write around positive things, lucky things, you need something to have a conflict. And so it is not about all his dreams coming true, but about a different way of dealing with nightmares. Yeah, I mean, in the surroundings, so yes. Although I think the writer is the most closed character, so to say, and the most we find out about him is through the story. The story reveals the most about him. Whereas the other characters, like for example the mother, who dies in the beginning, but it is told, her chapter is told from her perspective, of course, but it starts out with her coming home, like falling on the floor, but she doesn't die immediately, and she doesn't realize also that she's dying. I think we as a reader might very soon figure out that she's on the road there, but she's thinking she just can't move and will be all right, and she's telling that to herself. And while she's lying there, she's telling her that someone is going to save her, and so she thinks about the closest people she has, which are the other family members, and so she remembers every single one of them, which is in a way also the introduction to this family. And she thinks like maybe my son is going to save me, maybe my husband, maybe my daughter. And every time she thinks of them, and in the beginning she's very hopeful, and the end of that memory of one of these persons, she always thinks like, no, actually we don't really have a really good relationship, so this person might not save me. And then she jumps to the next person, and again the same thing happens, and in the end she realizes, no, maybe actually no one is going to save me, and she realizes that her family is not very happy actually, and that's also when she dies, which sounds very tragic, but it's also very funny. You have to believe me. Yeah, it's actually both. I mean, both stories have a very limited time, so it's not about like months and years of like grief and finding a new way into life. It is just like the instant reaction to an imminent death. So the death happens, and really only the few weeks after that, like that, it starts. I think at the point where, well, the death is told, and then we jump just like 2 weeks to the funeral, and the story really continues where the son thinks that he wishes they would have had an ad in the newspaper, about the death. But the father never did that because he doesn't believe in it, and he thinks like it just costs money and so on, and so he didn't want to do that. But and then so they all get together again for a certain weekend, and after that weekend they all visit separately that grave. And the last chapter, which is a very short chapter in the book, is again told from the mother's perspective, which is of course the grave. So in a way she like waves them all off. She welcomes them into the novel in the beginning, and in the end we again see all of them, how they have been influenced by the death, and how they behave differently at the grave. The one character is trying to tell herself that she's very happy, and the other character finally gives in and cries, and the other character says like, I hate you. But everybody is then left into the world, and we don't know how they will evolve in the future. But it's also a very, in that sense, actually a very short novel, because it's only about like dealing with the death in a good or bad way.